Okay, so you want to own a movie theater. You picture the marquee lighting up at dusk, the red velvet ropes, a line out the door on opening night for the movie everyone's been waiting for. You picture yourself as the person who built the room where people fell in love with a story, where a first date happened, where a kid saw a giant screen for the first time. Here's the number nobody puts on the brochure. The average movie ticket in the United States sells for $11.31. And on a huge share of that sale, sometimes on most of it, you don't keep the money. Someone else does. Not the government. Not the landlord. The studio that made the film. Run the ticket counter for an entire weekend. Sell out every showing of the biggest movie in the country, and you can still end the week owing more than you earned from those tickets alone. Not hypothetically. Regularly. Predictably. Built into the contract before a single seat sells. On a formula the studio negotiated before you ever opened your doors. The movie business looks like it sells movies. It doesn't, not primarily. It sells you a seat at a razor-thin margin, engineered almost to break even, so that it can sell you something else on the walk to that seat. And if you don't understand what that something else is, and why it matters more than the film itself, you don't understand this business at all. So let's open the projection booth, skip past the trailers, and look at the real ledger. Here's the fantasy. You own the screen, you own the seats, you own every dollar that walks through the door for a ticket. Here's the reality. You own the building. The film itself is on loan, on terms you didn't write. When a studio releases a film, it isn't selling the theater a copy to keep and profit from freely, the way a bookstore buys a novel outright. It's licensing a temporary right to project that film, under a contract the industry calls film rental terms, and that contract dictates exactly what share of every single ticket goes back to the studio, week by week, for as long as the movie plays on your screen. The split moves on a sliding scale, and it moves against you fastest right when the money is biggest. In week 1, the week with the lines around the block, the week everyone actually wants to see the movie before anyone spoils the ending online, the studio can take 70 to 80% of the box office gross. On the very biggest tentpole releases, some deals have pushed toward 90% in that opening frame. That's not 80% of the profit. That's 80% of the raw gross, before you've paid a single employee, before you've turned on a single air conditioner, before you've swept a single row of seats. By week 2, that number typically drops, maybe to 60% for the studio. By week 3 or 4, it keeps sliding, 50, then 40. Eventually, on a film that's still limping along a month into its run, the theater might be keeping the majority of what comes through the register. But by then the crowds have thinned out to almost nothing. The people who wanted to see it opening weekend already saw it. On the exact days the studio was taking the biggest bite. One side of this ledger, the busiest, most profitable-looking days of your entire month, packed houses and sold-out showtimes, where the studio is quietly collecting the largest cut you will ever pay them. The other side, the quiet, half-empty Tuesday matinees 3 weeks later, where you finally get to keep the better percentage, on a fraction of the traffic you had in week 1. There's also a safety net buried in these contracts called the house nut, a clause letting the theater deduct its baseline weekly operating costs before the percentage split even applies, or compare that deduction against the straight percentage and pay whichever number is higher for the studio. It sounds like it protects the exhibitor. In practice, it mostly protects the studio's minimum take, guaranteeing the distributor gets paid something close to the full negotiated rate no matter how the math shakes out on a slow week. Averaged across a full year, across an entire slate of releases from tentpoles to art house titles. The exhibitor, that's the industry term for you, the theater, ends up keeping somewhere around half of total box office revenue, sometimes a bit more, sometimes less depending on how aggressively the biggest studios negotiated. One real 10K filing from a major U.S. chain shows the shape of it clearly. $1.8 billion in ticket sales in a single fiscal year, and just under $1 billion of that, 51.8%, went straight back out the door as film rental before the theater covered rent, electricity, or a single paycheck. Go overseas and the split looks different but tells the same story. In the United Kingdom, a common structure runs at 35% of the gross going to the distributor or a flat minimum guarantee, whichever is greater, one of the more exhibitor-friendly arrangements in the world, and even there, Cinema staff routinely say ticket prices stay high because so much of every ticket leaves the building. And it's not just the split working against the theater. It's the shrinking window the split even applies to. For most of cinema history, a film played exclusively in theaters for 90 days, sometimes longer, before it showed up anywhere else. That window has collapsed over the last decade, down toward 45 days on many releases, sometimes less on titles a studio wants to push quickly onto its own streaming service. Every day shaved off that window is a day the theater loses a chance to claw back toward the friendlier end of the sliding scale, because the audience simply migrates to the couch faster than it used to. There are roughly 39,000 movie screens spread across a few thousand theater sites in the United States today, a number that has been quietly shrinking year over year since, well, before the pandemic accelerated it. Every one of those screens is running the same contract, the same sliding scale, the same shrinking window. None of them are exempt. And as we're about to see, that alone would sink the business. Nobody survives on a margin that thin from ticket sales alone. Not in the US, not in London, not anywhere the contract looks like this. Let's say you still want in. Here's what it actually costs to get the lights on before a single customer walks through your door. A modern multiplex, the kind with stadium seating, digital projection, and enough auditoriums to run 6 or 8 movies simultaneously, runs somewhere between $8 and $20 million to build from the ground up, depending on the market, the number of screens, and how premium you go on seating and sound. That number is before a single ticket is sold, before a single tub of popcorn is scooped, before you've paid rent for even 1 month. Digital projection alone isn't optional anymore, and it isn't cheap. Every screen needs a digital cinema package server and a projector meeting studio-mandated technical specifications, because studios will not ship a film to a booth that doesn't meet their format requirements. Each projector and server system runs well into 6 figures. Multiply that by the number of screens in your building, and the projection booth alone can cost more than most small businesses spend on their entire operation. Then come the standards you don't choose, the ones the studios and the premium format license holders set for you. Want to advertise a giant curved screen, an immersive sound format, a premium large format auditorium? You're paying licensing fees to whoever owns that format, on top of everything you already owe the studio for the film rights, on every single showing, whether the auditorium is full or half empty. Now the leases. Movie theaters eat enormous square footage, often 40 to 60,000 square feet per location, and they eat it in exactly the retail corridors and mall anchor positions that command the highest rents in a given market, because that's where the foot traffic is. You're not just renting a room to run a projector in. You're paying premium retail rent for a business model that only turns that expensive square footage over a handful of times per day, at fixed showtimes, unlike a clothing store or a restaurant that's generating revenue continuously from open to close. Then staffing. Ticket takers, concession staff, projectionists or booth technicians, ushers, cleaning crews between every single showing. Because a sticky floor or an overflowing trash can lose that customer permanently, not just for tonight. Wages sit near minimum wage for most frontline roles, but scheduling has to flex hard around evening and weekend peaks, exactly when demand spikes and labor costs spike right alongside it. Then the arms race nobody warns you about before you sign the lease. Recliner seating to replace old fixed rows can run 6 figures per auditorium once you factor in the reduced seat count the bigger chairs force on you. Premium audio systems. Enhanced projection formats. Because streaming exists now, sitting in every living room in the country for a fraction of the ticket price. And if your auditorium feels like a slightly bigger, slightly louder version of somebody's couch, you've already lost that customer for good. Layer these costs one on top of the other. Construction, projection technology, format licensing, prime retail rent, wall-to-wall staffing around peak hours, and the constant capital upgrades just to stay competitive with a phone-sized screen at home. And you understand something important before you've sold a single ticket to a single customer. And every one of those upgrades has to be maintained, not just installed once. Bulbs and laser light sources on premium projectors need periodic replacement running into the thousands of dollars per unit. Recliner mechanisms wear out with heavy daily use and need servicing. Sound calibration on a premium audio format has to be checked and recertified periodically by the format holder, or the theater risks losing the right to advertise that premium branding altogether, which means losing the small surcharge that made the upgrade worth installing in the first place. Staff turnover compounds all of it. Frontline theater jobs are entry-level, often a first job for a teenager or a part-time role for a student, and turnover in that kind of role runs high across all of retail and food service, not just cinemas. Every departure means recruiting, training, and retraining on point-of-sale systems, digital projection basics, and the customer service standards that keep people coming back instead of staying home. None of that shows up as a single dramatic line item. It shows up as a constant, quiet drag on the margin, year after year. This was never really a movie business. It was always a real estate and logistics business, wearing a movie business's face, financed by margins so thin on its headline product that the entire structure has to be subsidized by something else entirely. So if tickets barely cover the cost of showing the movie, where does the actual money come from? Walk past the box office. Walk toward the smell. That smell, warm, buttery, unmistakable the second you push through the lobby doors, isn't an accident of ventilation. It's one of the most deliberately engineered scents in retail, pumped intentionally toward the entrance, because it triggers an impulse purchase before the customer has even reached the counter. And here's the number that explains why theaters bother engineering a smell at all. A single serving of popcorn costs the theater under 50 cents to produce. It sells for $8 or more at the counter. The average medium popcorn nationally recently priced above $8. That's a markup well over 1,000%. Some estimates, accounting for the cheapest bulk kernels and oil, put the true markup above 1,200%. Compare the two products side by side, the way the theater's own accountants do. On the movie ticket, the studio takes up to 80% in the opening week, leaving the theater a sliver of a slim total. On a tub of popcorn, or a soda, or a box of candy bought in bulk and marked up at the register, the theater keeps 100% of the sale, no studio cut, no distributor fee, no rental split, nobody's standing between the register and the bank deposit. That's the entire model, laid bare in one comparison. Sell the primary product, the ticket, at a margin so thin it's barely a margin at all, purely to get a paying body through the door and into a seat. Then sell that same body the popcorn, the soda, the nachos, at margins north of 85%, where nearly every dollar collected is close to pure profit once the base food cost is covered. Look at where the profit actually concentrates inside a real chain's books. One major chain's public filings for a recent year showed roughly $1.8 billion in ticket revenue against about $1 billion paid out in distributor fees, leaving a thin residual before any operating costs. Concessions at that same chain brought in about $1.1 billion against a food and beverage cost of only around $180 million, an 84% margin, sitting almost entirely on the bottom line. Industry-wide, concessions typically make up somewhere around a fifth to a third of total revenue, but they generate closer to half of total gross profit. At two of the largest U.S. chains, concessions alone account for roughly 36 to 39% of total company revenue. Not a side hustle, a core business line running in parallel to the one on the marquee. Ticket sales bring in the bigger top-line number, the one that makes headlines on opening weekend. Concessions bring in the money that's actually still sitting in the account at the end of the year. One theater executive put it bluntly to a reporter years ago, without the markup on snacks, ticket prices themselves would have to roughly double just to keep the doors open. And the average moviegoer isn't spending pocket change at that stand anymore, either. Recent surveys put average concession spending per customer at over $16 a visit, creeping past, in many cases exceeding, the price of the ticket that got them in the door in the first place. Layer in the smaller channels too, because none of them are accidental. Pre-show advertising, sold to local and national brands, paid out based on verified audience counts per slide. Trailers, which studios pay theaters to screen ahead of a release, calculated after the fact from reported attendance numbers, not upfront. Gift cards, which generate cash today for a service redeemed, or sometimes never redeemed, much later. And subscription loyalty programs, unlimited or discounted monthly movie passes, where the theater collects a flat fee every month from a subscriber base, cash in hand well before most of those customers ever redeem a single showing. Look closer at the subscription piece, because it might be the cleverest cash flow mechanic in the entire building. A monthly unlimited movies membership, priced somewhere in the $20 to $25 range depending on the chain and the market, gets charged to a customer's card on the same day every month, whether that customer walks into the theater 0 times that month or 6 times. The theater books that revenue immediately. The cost of actually seating that customer for a film and the film rental split owed to the studio on each visit only gets triggered later, when and if the customer actually shows up. A subscriber who forgets to cancel or simply gets busy for a few months is close to pure profit sitting in the theater's account, collected in advance for a service never claimed. None of these headline as the movie business. All of them, together, are the actual business. The film on the marquee is the bait. Everything after the box office window is the trap, a trap the customer walks into willingly because the smell got there first. And as we're about to see, when every one of these secondary streams gets hit at once, when nobody's walking through the lobby to smell the popcorn in the first place, for months at a stretch, the entire structure that looked so resilient on paper collapses fast, and it collapses in a very specific, very public way. By the end of 2021, Cineworld Group, the London-based parent company of Regal Cinemas, the second-largest theater chain in the United States, was carrying net debt of $8.9 billion. Even stripping out lease obligations from that figure, the number still sat at roughly $4.8 billion. This wasn't a company that mismanaged its popcorn margins. The concession math was fine. The pandemic had shut cinemas worldwide for extended stretches through 2020, and even after reopening, the film release schedule stayed disrupted for well over a year because studios delayed their biggest, most bankable titles rather than release tentpoles into half-empty auditoriums. No blockbusters in the release calendar meant no crowds at the door. No crowds meant no concessions moving across the counter. No concessions meant no cash to service a debt pile that had been built up over a decade of aggressive, pre-pandemic global expansion, acquisitions, new builds, premium format rollouts, all financed on the assumption that the crowds would simply keep showing up. By August 2022, the warning signs were fully public. Cineworld's stock collapsed by more than 50% in a single trading session after reports leaked that a bankruptcy filing was imminent, then kept sliding through the following week. On September 7, 2022, it happened. Cineworld filed for Chapter 11 protection in a bankruptcy court in Texas, listing operations spanning 747 sites and more than 9,000 screens across 10 countries. One of the largest bankruptcy filings the exhibition industry had ever seen. 12 U.S. locations closed within the following weeks. Older, rundown venues in markets like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle-Tacoma, the ones least likely to be worth renegotiating a lease over. Then, in January 2023, 39 more Regal theaters across the country were marked for closure in a single court filing. Lease rejections projected to save the company roughly $22 million a year in fixed costs. Anaheim, Berkeley, El Cajon, Miami Beach, locations that had sold tickets and 85% margin popcorn to the same regulars for decades, closed by a bankruptcy filing rather than a declining audience. Now put a second theater chain right beside Cineworld, because this is where the other side, of this story gets genuinely strange. AMC Theaters, the largest chain in the country, was carrying a serious debt load of its own, roughly $5.5 billion by the summer of 2022. By almost any conventional financial logic, AMC should have been standing in the same bankruptcy courtroom as Cineworld within the year, filing alongside its closest competitor. It didn't, because AMC had something Cineworld never had, a wave of retail investors online who had turned its stock into a cultural symbol during 2021, driving the share price to levels that had almost nothing to do with box office receipts, film rental splits, or concession margins. AMC's leadership used that window aggressively, issuing new shares directly into that enthusiasm, and at one point creating an entirely new class of preferred stock, nicknamed AP by the market, specifically designed to raise fresh capital without triggering the shareholder votes a normal new stock issuance would have required. 2 theater chains, comparable debt levels, comparable pandemic damage, comparable exposure to the exact same film rental economics, and the exact same 85% concession margins described a moment ago. One went through federal bankruptcy court and closed dozens of locations. The other stayed solvent by selling equity to an online community that liked its ticker symbol. Cineworld formally exited Chapter 11 in 2023. It had cut roughly $4.5 billion in debt, raised $800 million in fresh equity capital, and secured more than $1.7 billion in new debt financing just to keep operating through the restructuring. Regal survived the process, smaller, leaner, carrying several hundred fewer screens than it had walked in with 2 years earlier. But notice what this case study actually proves, because it's easy to draw the wrong lesson from it. It wasn't the popcorn margin that broke Cineworld. 85% margins on soda and candy don't, on their own, collapse a multi-billion-dollar balance sheet. It was debt, leverage taken on during good years, still sitting on the books in full when a global shock arrived, and the doors simply couldn't open for months at a time. The concession stand kept doing exactly what it was designed to do. The capital structure underneath it didn't. So who actually wins in this industry, over the long run, when you strip away any single quarter's headline? Not the operator running the projector. The operator absorbs the real estate risk, the $8 to $20 million building, the premium mall anchor lease, the recliner upgrade every 7 or 8 years just to stay competitive with a couch. The operator absorbs the staffing risk, the maintenance risk, and, as Cineworld just proved in a Texas bankruptcy court, the debt risk, all while handing away the majority of ticket revenue in the exact weeks when the most people are actually walking through the door. The studios win differently, and they win by design. They don't own the buildings. They don't pay the electric bill for the air conditioning running through a July heat wave. They don't schedule the teenage staff for a Friday night rush or replace a torn recliner. They collect the steepest percentage of the gross in the single highest traffic week of a film's entire theatrical run, then move on to the next release on the calendar, carrying none of the fixed costs of the room the movie actually played in. While the operator is financing recliner seating and premium sound systems just to keep customers from staying home and streaming the next release 45 days later, the studio has already collected the bulk of its money from the theatrical window and shifted its attention and its marketing budget to the next title on the slate. Not because theaters are badly run, as a rule. Not because moviegoers stopped showing up entirely. Box office revenue has recovered substantially since the depths of the pandemic. Because the entire contractual structure of this industry was built over decades of negotiation to protect the party that owns the intellectual property, and to leave the party that owns the real estate carrying almost all of the operational risk underneath it. The asset-light side of this equation, the side that licenses a product for a fixed, shrinking window and takes the largest cut on the single busiest days, wins by structural design, in good years and in bad ones. The asset-heavy side, the buildings, the decades-long leases, the wall-to-wall staffing, the debt sitting on the balance sheet, carries the risk that shows up the moment a shock hits the release calendar. A pandemic, a prolonged writers' and actors' strike that empties the pipeline of new films, or simply a thin, disappointing slate of releases in a given year. Even the loyalty programs described a moment ago tilt the same direction over time. A subscriber locked into a flat monthly fee keeps the theater's cash flow smoother during a slow release quarter. But every visit that subscriber redeems still triggers a film rental payment back to the studio on whatever title they choose to watch. The studio gets paid either way, on a per-visit basis, regardless of what the theater charged the customer up front to walk in. That's the actual hidden economics of a movie theater. It was never really a movie business. It was a real estate business that happens to rent its floor space out by the film and survives, not on the film itself, but on everything sold in the 11 feet between the box office window and the auditorium door. The smell hits you again on your way out, the same warm, buttery air that pulled you toward the counter 2 hours earlier without you fully deciding to walk that way. It's still working. It'll work on the next person walking in for the next showing tonight, and the one after that, long after the film you just watched has left theaters entirely and moved on to a streaming platform. The ticket got you through the door. The popcorn kept the lights on. So here's the question worth sitting with the next time you're standing in that lobby, wallet already half open before you've even reached the counter. Are you paying for the movie in front of you? Or are you paying for everything the movie itself had to give away in that opening week contract just to get you into the room in the first place? And when the next global shock arrives at this industry, because there will be a next one, which side of this business do you think actually survives it? The side that owns the story and moves on to the next release, or the side that owns the seats, the leases, and the debt still sitting on the books?